Usk's railway was built on the pretense of something much grander. So up in Antiglo, they struck iron. They had plentiful iron deposits and they needed something to do with it. And so what they wished to do was, you had the steel foundries in the Forest of Dean. They'd been going for several hundred years, since the Roman times, and so they wished to the financiers of the railway hoped that they would be able to make their fortune by bringing steel and coal from Antiglo over to the iron foundries in the Forest of Dean. As a result, the railway was built specifically wide to account for this flow of traffic, which unfortunately never materialised. Why transport iron from Monmouthshire to the Dean Forest when you can just simply build an iron foundry in Monmouthshire? So unfortunately, it was built under the pretense. Here we go, railway mania. It was built under the pretense, and it never fulfilled it. So here is our first railway. So this one, Newport, Abergavenny and Hereford Railway. This is where we start our journey, specifically from here, Pontypool Road, which we shall, there we go. We have a lovely Pontypool Road, totally unrecognisable from what it is today, unfortunately. Beautiful building, beautiful lamppost, beautiful steam engine. I'm not biased. So, Pontypool Road opened in 1854. So, very early on in the railway period. Railways have been in Britain now for about 20-25 years. However, it didn't open as Pontypool Road. It opened in the August. No, it didn't. It opened in the January. However, it opened under the name Hereford Road. No, it didn't. Newport Road. We'll get there in the end. We'll travel around a bit. So, it opened under the name of Newport Road. However, it didn't last very long, and in the August, it changed to what everyone became known to everybody as Pontypool Road. So, also a bit of history about Pontypool Road here. So, opened January 1854, which, as I just said. First station master, Henry Griffiths. He became so well known in the area that you eventually ended up with Griffithstown, named after Henry Griffiths. Also, for those, I'm not sure if we have any in here that ever worked under British Railways or under any of the steam. Pontypool Road was also the birthplace of the Association Society of Locomotive Engineers and Firemen, so the beginning of what is today the modern railway unions. Whether that's positive or negative, we'll see. And so for Pontypool Road, although it started off with humble beginnings, it soon grew to be something far greater than it was. And here we have a few beautiful pictures of the old Pontypool Road. And key point to note here is the road bridge. That is still here now. However, Pontypool soon expanded with various railways, and it became the terminus for many of the valley lines, as well as our very line that we will be coming here today. So in 1909, they built a new one. This one was built on the opposite side of the road bridge, where the modern station is today. It consisted of two large platforms. I believe they were capable of a capacity of 11 carriages, as well as two small bay platforms at either end. Now this provided far greater streamlining for the services travelling through, and you could catch a train from Pontypool Road anywhere in the UK, as you could from most stations in those days. Including this is a truly gigantic goods yard and engine shed, which I think we would fathom to think of today. On the side you can see on your left you have some carriages. They are, well, being shunted round ready to take passengers all around the UK. And so here we have a bit of information. So it was a large island platform station, which meant that to access it, you had to access it via the underground, which is still there today. Although you now have the above footbridge. So what else have we got? So we've got waiting rooms, larger waiting rooms. I'm not sure off the top of my head whether they were still segregated for sex at that time, I wouldn't like to say. But also, the other key thing to note is due to the gigantic proportions of the station, we now need 3 signal boxes. Now, signal boxes are very complex machines, and so we have 3. So, very conveniently named, we have Pontypool South signal box, Pontypool Middle signal box, and Pontypool North signal box. So, to give you a bit of additional information about these, Pontypool South signal box, they all opened with the station, by the way, 1909. Pontypool South had 163 levers in its signal box and controlled the whole south workings of the station, as well as just off to the side here you have the glass works. You also had lines off up to Glenavon, Taff Vale Extension Railway, and beyond over to Haverdrunnis, etc. Then you have, I quite like this one, Pontypool Middle signal box, located directly between the 2 waiting rooms, and it consisted of 2 small ground frames, which are essentially small signal boxes, but they're not manned, and as you would a normal signal box. And they allowed the 2 large island platforms to be divided in 2. So you could, rather than just having 2 large trains, you could have 4 small ones. And then lastly, we have rather sorry looking north signal box here. This is taken just after closure in about 1970, I believe. This signal box had 65 levers, so smaller by comparison. However, it didn't have the goods yard and everything. It mainly controlled the comings into the station as well as the distance signals. So this leads us on to our line now. The Colford, Monmouth, Usk and Pontypool Railway, built 1861. And so this will be our journey we travel today, as well as a brief extension on here. So our journey begins with trusted 1422 at the helm. So one key thing to note here, 1422 was not actually rostered on many of these photographs. It's most of the photographs are taken by a gentleman called Casterly. He came out one day, quite by chance, with his lady wife, and was expecting what would become known as a Great Western diesel rail car. However, that had failed in the morning at Pontypool Road, and so 1422 took over. So, I'm not quite sure how well you can see it, but here we have a bit of a timetable for our line. This is done towards the end of the closure, so about 1954. At this point, British Railways went absolutely mad with the railways. Beforehand, this line had only had 6 trains a day. However, they were struggling financially, and so British Railways suddenly went, right, we'll chuck a load of trains at them. And so you end up with about 18 trains per day travelling along this line, which is astronomical for the area that we have. So, there we go. So, our first station that we arrive at is Little Mill Junction. So, what's Little Mill Junction? It's history. So, originally opened with the railway in 1854 as Little Mill. However, it closed. So, closed 1861. There wasn't a great deal of passengers. It was also at that time, it was the terminus of the railway. So the railway line from Usk, no trains proceeded any further past Little Mill. And so as a result, you had a station here that consisted of 3 platforms. So you had platform 1, platform 2, and then you had platform 3, which ran next to the signal box by there. This made it very complex. You had footbridges, you had passengers getting off. It was an additional stop for commuters. They just left Pontypool, they only travelled a mile and they had to stop again. It wasn't very feasible, so they closed it. However, they then realised, well, we're now cutting off the local community. And so in 1883, they reopened it. So just 22 years and they reopened it. But they changed it to Little Mill Junction, which it kept its name even to this day, still Little Mill Junction. However, on 30th of May 1955, it closed for passengers for good. So the keynote with Little Mill is it is the only point of industry on the line as a whole. Little Mill Brickworks, and so I very fortunately found this brick here, as they say, Blue Peter fashion. This is one I prepared earlier. So, Little Mill Brickworks. I've got a bit of a history here for you. No, I don't. It's disappeared. Anyway, Little Mill Brickworks, the main industry on the line. It provided the nylon. Many of the buildings along the line were produced using Little Mill bricks. It closed in the 1960s, I believe, and just this photograph was taken in 1983. Shortly after this, it was demolished, most of the buildings, and for several years it was used as a go-kart track. I don't know what its purpose is at the moment. If anybody knows, please do let me know. And so here we have a few photographs of Little Mill Junction. So here we can see the main platform here, and you can just see here the original platform 2, and then platform 3 would have been on the opposite side. So we've got Little Mill signal box here as well. Opened with the station, and that consisted of 40 levers, and well, it's still in use today. In the 1970s, it was modernised, and its number of levers was reduced down to 17, but it had all the modern electronic signalling equipment. Today, like I said, the junction is still in use, although there is still one siding. The rest of it has been totally demolished and is unrecognisable now, unfortunately. So we move on to the unknown halts. So, what are the unknown halts? Well, this name may give it away. Glasgoyd, home of the ROF in this area anyway. So first of all, we get Glasgoyd halt here. Now this one was a civilian halt, so this one is more known. Opened 1927. Now, what is a halt? A halt is an unmanned station, typically made quite cheaply, specifically by the Great Western Railway, although other railways did also adopt it. It was a sort of addition to the original lines that had been built by these initial railway pioneers. So for the people of Glasgow, they had no station near them. It was a very long trek to Little Mill or to Glasgow to catch the trains. So as a result, Great Western Railway during the 1920s, right the way up until nationalisation, proceeded to construct a series of smaller halts all across their network to try and improve passenger figures. And for some lines it worked quite well, for others it was too little, too late. So we have Glasgow halt here. Another key thing to note, Glasgow halt is built on this side of the line here. However, when it opened in 1927, it was originally built by here. Why did it move? They built the ROF. So when they built the ROF, they had to move the halt to the opposite side to allow the new points and point rodding and tracks into the ROF itself. So, and then we've got 14 miles, 48 chains from Monmouth Troy. And then this is what's called a Great Western Pagoda style. So, a little bit to add. So, now we have the two that are very unknown. So we have Glasgow Crossing Halt, also known as Glasgow West Access, and also Glasgow East Access. Now, these two halts were built specifically for the MOD, and so you could only get off at these halts with a pass, because otherwise you would be escorted quickly back onto the train by MOD police. So these two halts, they were built for the ROF, like I said. So they opened so West Access opened in June 41, and then East Access follows suit in February 43. So they served the ROF and both closed with the railway in May 55. So to give you a point of reference, you have the main road down through the Monkswood housing estate now, and by here now you have the main barrier gates into the RF. So it's situated just on the other side, and the rail gates, although modernised, they are still there. You can still just about see them from there if you get close to the gate. So to control all of this, they had to build a signal box. So here we have Glasgow signal box. Again, looking a little bit sorry for itself. Windows very badly smashed. and all round looking very sad. So, Glasgow signal box. It opened in 38. It consisted of 61 levers and eventually closed in 62. When they transitioned the site then over to ground frame working. So rather than having a designated signalman, you would have a gentleman on the ground. He would jump off the loco, change the points, jump back on. A lot more footwork. But no, so Glasgow signal box, and it controlled the main line, it controlled all the signalling, it controlled the points into the RAF station itself, as well as their various sidings, and they had many sidings. So speaking of that, we have the main RAF Glasgow station. So the station was built specifically to bring manpower into the RAF during World War II. So the RAF was built, started construction in 38 and achieved full output by 41 and 42. And so to do this, they needed to bring in a massive workforce from all across South Wales and parts of England. And so as a result, we have these 3 large platforms, 1, 2, 3, and each platform could hold a coach, a train of 11 coaches. So shows you the vast number of people that had to be brought in to work on these things. And here you have the footbridge to access. And here it is, many years later in the 60s, looking rather sorry for itself. Footbridge is still visible, and you've still got the mainline tracks. So, working up in Glenavon, I've encountered many people up there. There's a gentleman up there, Arthur Llewellyn. I'm very pleased to call him a friend of mine. He was on this rail tour here, so this happened in the 60s. And when I showed him this photograph, he said that the caption for it should be "Moments After Disaster." Why disaster? Well, nobody bothered to inform the MOD police that a train was going to be arriving. And so there, this DMU arrived, they all got off of the train, they began to walk round, they took photographs, and then what surrounded them? Armed guards, dogs. And he said they were quickly escorted back onto the train whilst the driver and guard spoke to the MOD police and essentially told them what had happened, and obviously someone hadn't got the memo in the morning. All were fine, nobody was injured, however they were only able to remain on the platform. They couldn't go and examine the rest of the site. So, being the site that it was, it had various little industrial engines. And so we have 2 here, so we have Roberts at the top and War Department RF Glasgow number 3. So Glasgow, because of its military origins, quite a lot of the information is quite difficult to get hold of. So the exact number of engines that it had is unknown. However, we know of at least 4. So here we have 2 and here are another 2. So here's Roberts again, and here is Little Drake. So we have Roberts, for those of you who like your numbers, was number 2083, and Drake was number 2086. So very close. They were both built for the RAF and arrived RAF Glasgow about 1940-1941. So to start there. Now both of these photographs here aren't taken Glasgow. This photograph here is taken at Newport Tube Works, and this photograph here is taken at McNavy's colliery, because steam engines and munitions don't really work that well. I leave it to you to work out why. So for both of these, they weren't typical coal-fired steam engines. Some steam engines have spark arresters, these ones didn't. These 2 were oil-fired. And to give you an idea of how strict they were, I'm not quite sure how visible it is, however, you can see these 2 little dots on either end of Drake. Well, these were electric lamps, so it shows that they couldn't even have paraffin headlamps on locos. So it shows that the dangers that they had. So having 2 fire-breathing steam engines trundling around, not the best idea. So they were soon replaced with the newly coming up diesels, which were built off of the steam engine chassis. So Drake, very fortunately, survives. So we have 2 preserved examples of Glasgow. shunters. So Drake now resides in the old Andrew Barclay headquarters up in Scotland, and here we have another unidentified Glasgow shunter, which is at, where is it? Sharpness, I believe it is. I think that's the Heritage Railway. Thank you. So, these two are very well survived. Obviously Drake is no longer functioning. I'm not entirely sure that there are actually any oil-fired steam engines in preservation operational. So, now we move on to the bit we're all here for, Usk Station. So Usk Station, 2 platforms, lovely little mill brick station. It's quite odd. It's an odd station. Main thing being, its goods yard. Its goods yard is situated on the other side of a river. Now, this isn't common practice because goods yards, they're there to serve the public. But what use is it on the other side of a river? So, here we have, behind this iron railings, we have a very small goods yard that they constructed, predominantly for cattle. However, it was for the more urgent requirements of it. So, Usk Station, it opened in 1856, so it actually opened a year before the main railway line opened, and reason for this is they used it as the main construction point for the rest of the line. So all the supplies were brought into Usk, and from there then they used Usk as the point to push forward towards Monmouth. Now, I know Usk, growing up in the area, I know Usk loves its flowers, and so that's why I thought we've got to include this one. Lovely bit of Usk in bloom, 7-foot high creepers to form the lovely station names. Now, obviously you would never get anything like that on modern railways. However, in these times, very similar to Usk in bloom, railway stations, railway lines, companies even, they had competitions for best kept stations, and so you would have stations competing for these titles. Now, obviously the history of Usk we have here. I'm not sure as to how drastic the competition was. However, I do know that for the Wye Valley line there was very severe competition between Redbrook and Tintern stations. Redbrook was very well known for their climbing roses and Tintern for their flower beds. They were also then in competition with Simmons Yacht, which had splendid views, and there were many accounts of the station masters going to each other's stations and before competitions attempting a little bit of sabotage. We won't go into those politics there. So here we have a lovely view of Usk Station, and this is actually taken after the line has closed. So there are no passengers anymore, commuter services stopped, all the stations are unmanned. However, 2 years after the line, we have a Stephenson's Locomotive Society travelled along the line. And they did this to mark the centenary of the railway's opening. So 1957, 2 years after the line closed, they came back to mark the centenary. However, in the distance, we also have a South Wales DMU. So DMUs, diesel multiple units, they took over from the steam. You didn't need run rounds or anything, so they were quick, they were efficient. However, in the 50s, there weren't that many of them. And so what did they need? They needed somewhere to train. And what better place to train than an abandoned railway line? And so therefore Usk saw a new lease of life up until 1964 as a DMU training centre for modern British rail drivers. And key to this is obviously Usk signal box. Now I've been shown the way of the signal boxes by many people on my Facebook page, one in particular, Reg Ianstone. He has told me an awful lot about the signal boxes and a lot of the information that goes with them. So a signal box here we have, it was a 37 lever box. It controlled the station as well as the goods yard. So it had point rodding that travelled all the way across the other side of the river, which is quite astonishing, really. And I dread to think how difficult it was to pull said lever to change the points. Also, by here, we have a Wickham trolley point. Now, Wickham trolleys, they were, well, like you would imagine in the Westerns. They are the pump trolleys that you see travelling up and down the line, and they're for the P-Way departments to go and examine lines, move new sleepers, ballast, etc., etc. And so there's another little bit of history there that Usk was involved in the maintenance of the tracks. And so here is quite unclear, it's not the most clearest stuff here anyway, but here we have Usk Station. So here's the main station here with the footbridge, and then you have the road bridge, you have the river, and here you have Usk Goods Yard. Now, Usk Goods Yard is quite difficult to get into. Most goods yards is off the main line. You pull in, you pull out the same way. However, Usk, you have to come into the station, reverse back over a point into what's called a head shunt, and then push your load back. It's a bit of a complex move. However, for most railwaymen, it was a bit of fun. Everybody loved to do the shunting because you got to play trains. And so here we have a beautiful example of a Great Western Hawksworth leaving Usk Goods Yard in 1962. This engine, it was allocated to Pontypool Road. It was later withdrawn and it retired and was later scrapped after only being in service for 13.5 years, to the cost of, I believe it was about 20,000, which is about £500,000 in today's money. Now that doesn't sound most economically valuable, and unfortunately it wasn't, but for the political situation at the time, steam was being phased out and diesel was being phased in, and so many of these projects, like this locomotive here, it was actually registered before the Second World War. So it took 10, 20 years for some engines to come through because of the war restrictions of steel and other materials. So we now leave Usk to another unique station, if you can call it that. We have Cefn Halt. Now, I've done a great deal of research into this, and as far as I can tell, it holds the record as the UK's shortest platform. It was a staggering 12 foot in length and was able to allocate one door onto the platform. It was so small it could not even hold its own name board. So, why was it built, I hear you say? Well, why would something like this be built? Obviously for the gentry. Cefn, you've got Cefn Court. Lord Raglan specifically requested a station to be constructed here. He believed, when the Great Western Railway began to produce these halts, he believed that small halts like this, near to his places of residence, they would allow his members of staff as well as visitors to easily access it. However, I have no idea if anybody ever used the halt. Evidently they must have for the train to have stopped. However, we don't know exactly how much. Unfortunately, for many of the halts, there isn't a great deal to say. They had a short life, they were made of timber, some of them had a steel structure. If you put a steel structure on here, it would probably engulf the platform. So we then move on to Llandenny Station. So Llandenny Station, like the rest of it, opened 1857. It was a small platform. It was located a mile away from Llandenny, so relatively few passengers. We have from here, mind you, there were still some people wandering through Llandenny evidently. 1903 they issued 9,367 tickets, which may sound like a lot. Pontypool Road last year issued 121,000 tickets. So it's a very small station by comparison. But it does have a lovely little signal box. And this signal box only had 11 levers, and it controlled a level crossing where this photograph is taken. I wouldn't really want to be stood there to be run over by a car or train. A bit of a dubious position to stand. But you also then, to this side of the photograph, you had their small goods yards where they would offload coal and coke for the village, as well as livestock. That is what this line was very, very heavily used for, the agriculture. And so in 1913, they handled 95 wagons of cattle, and each wagon held between 20 to 30 cattle. So you've got about 200 cattle coming through Llandenny, whether that be going off to market or receiving new cattle they don't really state. But yes, there's not a great deal to say. It was unfortunately closed in 55 with the station. It wasn't economically viable, but it did have a staff of 3. So you had the station master and 2 porters, and I certainly hope they got along well, being trapped in there together for many hours. So from there then we moved to Raglan, and we have Raglan Road Crossing Halt. Again, we have a lovely photograph of the Stephenson's special in 1957 with a very heavily battered Raglan Road Crossing platform. So this was a halt. However, it didn't start life off as a halt. This was originally the main station for Raglan, and it was situated 4.5 miles away from Raglan. Where's the logic here? So, Raglan Road Crossing, it was closed. It only lasted 20 years. We wonder what they did for 20 years. But it closed, and they thought that was done. However, it is near a path, an old bridle path, and so they found that there were people that wished to board the train, and so they reopened it as Raglan Road Crossing Halt. And the building in the background is still there today, although I doubt you'll still be able to see the platform. It was also one of the rare platforms that it didn't have a shelter on it, so you wouldn't want to be stood there in the rain. So next we have Raglan Station itself, and here is one of my previously mentioned Great Western rail cars. They were seen as the future, and for Great Western at the time, it didn't play out like that. In the long run, they did. They went on to form the modern day DMUs and electric multiple units that we have today. So very much a forerunner before its time. Typical of the Art Deco style, it had what was called a razor design. You also had ones that had a more curved appearance, but these were the more typical of them. So Raglan Station, again, another lovely red brick, little mill brick station, very similar in design to us. For many of the stations, it was a case of rinse and repeat. If you've mastered something, why improve on it? Just copy and paste. And so, being a later addition to the railway, it opened in 1876. So it opened about 20 years after the main railway had started. Rather than rip all the track out and lay new tracks for a double platform station where you're not going to get that many people, they stuck with the tried and tested single platform. But we have a different view here, and here you can see the goods yards. So here is what goods yards typically look like. Here you have your main line here, and you have a small goods yard just running off, and it links back on here. And here is the cattle docks. So this is where most of the work took place on the railways. And so for Raglan, they had in 1913 a staggering 176 cattle wagons come through, as well as that same year they issued just over 10,000 tickets. So quite a lot more lively than Llandeni Station. And then again we have another photograph of it during the Stephenson's special. Here is the same goods yard just off to the side here, and the cattle dock, very heavily overgrown now. You've also got, just in the distance, it's probably not very visible, but you also had, it looked a little bit like a crane, but it had an arch, and I'm not entirely sure of its purpose. I believe it was to stop things that were on top of the wagons from travelling out, very much like you've got with lorries and buses nowadays, to knock the snow off the top. I don't know. I'm quite happy to be proven wrong on that point. But back to Raglan Station. This is it shortly before demolition, and it's been saved, thankfully. It has now been taken on by National Museum of Wales and will be, hopefully in the not too distant future, rebuilt at St Fagans for the public to see. So we don't know whether they will be opening it as part of a heritage railway or just a static exhibit. For us in the heritage railway community, we very much hope that St Fagans adds a short section of track that they can then show members of the public what it was originally like. So going back to Lord Raglan, we have another of his halts, Elmsbridge Halt. So it was located deep in a cutting, and the total population surrounding it equaled 4. What did it serve? It served the farm. So there wasn't a very big population. It was another idea of Lord Raglan's to try and encourage his workforce to use the station. So he hoped that they would be able to use these halts. However, Elmsbridge Halt, if you travel up the 449, before the Raglan turn-off, you'll have a series of conifer trees. That is where the original Raglan station was. When you go round the bend, on that bend there, that was Elmsbridge. Well, there's not a great deal of distance between the two. So I think it was about 500 yards between Raglan station and Elmsbridge. So they might as well have just got off at Raglan. So again, here it is, shortly before closure, very simple in design, wooden platform. Typically the platforms were made out of coal ash, it was cheap, they had tons of it coming out of the steam engines. They were quite economical things. So now we have little Dingerstow station.
The Kevin Halt and the Elmsbridge one.
Yes.
What date? What was that?
So Elmsbridge Halt opened in 1933, in the November, and
we can identify which Lord Raglan.
now you're pushing. I'm not very up
It's
to
going to
date
be,
on
no,
mine.
I mean, that's provided us with information that we
Oh.
can go and do that.
Kevin Halt opened in June 54. Oh yes, that was another point to add about Kevin Halt. It is also one of the shortest lived stations in the UK as well. It had an operational period of just 11 months. It opened in June 54 and closed in the following May. So less than a year of operation. Thankfully, it was so small, so cheap, hopefully it didn't cost too much. So now we have Dingerstow Station. Dingerstow, very similar to all ones previously covered. Simple single platform station. However, this one had a staggering station staff of 1. Just the station master by himself. He had to do it all. He had a small signal box which had 17 levers, so a few more than Llandenny. He also had tickets to issue as well as assisting people on and off of the trains. However, by this point, most of the trains they were issuing tickets on the go, so they had the guard issuing tickets. So for Dingerstow, they cut their losses with the signal box quite early on, whereas Llandenny retained its signal box until its closure. Dingerstow's signal box closed in 31 and just was replaced by 2 small ground frames, which quite conveniently we have here. So here is the lever here, and you have the point rodding travelling off down there. Now, Dingerstow in 1923 handled a staggering 50 animal wagons. So again, even Dingerstow had some level of productivity for the agriculture, although it was situated a fair distance away from the town, and the village at that time only had a population of 196 people. I'm not sure how many are currently living there now. So now we near Monmouth. So here we have Monmouth Troy Road Rail Depot. So this here was where, first of all, we have a lovely little crane here, hand crane. Wouldn't want to be the one to operate that. But this was as the railway started to transition and the road network started to pick up. So lots of products were still transported by rail. However, it was a long old journey on a horse and cart to take your products out to the towns or even to bring them to the railways. And so before they were loaded on by hand. However, towards the later period, you started to have these road rail depots appear where they could then begin to load mass products onto the railways. So it was a healthy partnership between road and railways. They both respected each other's boundaries, as it were. Also, we have lovely Monmouth-Troy tunnel, not to be confused with the Gibraltar tunnels that you travel through now on the 449. Monmouth-Troy tunnel is actually still there. It is currently used as a firing range. So how things change and how things are repurposed, in all fairness. And so here we have Monmouth-Troy. So this is the opposite side of the tunnel. So there's the rail depot here, and here we have 1455, just changing platforms after returning with a most likely a Ross on Wye service. So Monmouth-Troy was the largest station aside from Pontypool Road, obviously on the line. It had 2 platforms, but it had a staff of about 18 to 21, and so there was a lot of hustle and bustle. They had a truly gigantic goods yard, but like most stations in this period, it was situated very far away from the town. If you come where you've got the modern day Troy Gardens is built on the original station's goods yard. So if that helps paint a visual picture to anybody over where it is. So here we have a few photographs of Monmouth-Troy. So here's 1455, shortly before that previous photograph was taken. And here we have another Stephenson's Locomotive Society rail journey. So this one was in 1959 in the January. It was done 2 days before the closure of the line, and it travelled from Ross on Wye to Monmouth to Chepstow. And it was there to allow a last hurrah almost for the railways, allow people to come out, take photographs and to witness the line as it was. And so we have some lovely signals here and a wonderful crowd gathered on the platform to say goodbye to Monmouth-Troy, as it were, as the following day would be the last day of passenger services. Another point to note about Monmouth-Troy is it was also involved in the funeral of Charles Rolls, a very well-known man within Monmouth. He has his statue outside of the Shire Hall. Here we have the coffin being loaded or unloaded onto the train. We don't know why the funeral was part of the funeral was at Monmouth. It has never been 100% confirmed. However, this is believed to be him in the photograph, and so this was 1910, and so here you have some wonderful Great Western cholesterol carriages, which were the height of style in the period. You also have the lovely footbridge, as well as station building and waiting shelter. The footbridge, there is one very similar to this still at Chepstow, which has been lovingly restored there. So here we have a bit more of a general view of Monmouth-Troy. So here we have the main station building. So this had your ticket office, your station master's office, your toilets, waiting rooms, and then here we have the most important building on the railway, the tea room. Where else are we going to get our refreshments? So it's not known why it never had a canopy. It was designed to have one. It was supposed to have one. It was never built. They don't really know why. But it was used quite regularly by members of staff. It was the terminus for 3 railways. So you had the line from Pontypool terminated in Monmouth, from Ross, and then from Chepstow. So you had 3 major lines terminating at Monmouth-Troy station. And as well as the passengers, we also have a few of the goods here. And so here, both of these photographs are evidently taken after the railway's closure. So Monmouth-Troy, for the rest of the line, it closed in 55, and that was it. From Usk up to Monmouth, that was no more. There was no more railway. From Usk, it continued with freight traffic until 62, when eventually the line was then reduced down to Glasgow, which continued in use until 1992, obviously serving the RAF. Monmouth-Troy here, it closed the passenger services 3rd of January 1959, but continued for a further 5 years as a goods goods railway. So goods travelled up from Chepstow or from Ross to Monmouth and could then be marshalled, and which is what we see here. And here is a better photograph of the goods yard. So the goods yard consisted of 6 sidings, a goods shed, cattle docks, a crane, and a variety of other small buildings, which we can see by here their intended purpose. We're not entirely sure. Most likely they would have been places to have stored coal and whatever and other supplies that they would need whilst doing shunting. So the goods yard, it was a very bustling place, vast place, as I said. Troy Gardens inhabits most of it. Off to the side here, and is now in somebody's back garden, they will find a random hole in the rock at the bottom of their garden, and this was actually part of a railway line that was supposed to, a 4th railway line which was supposed to go from Monmouth up to Hay-on-Wye. This unfortunately never materialised. The company that started to construct the line soon went bankrupt only a number of years after construction, so they only ever managed to build the tunnel. So that is what would become the end of the railway mania, as many of these promised railway lines never materialised. They, many financiers were swindled out of their money, and so by the 1870s the railway mania had really crashed down, and it was a struggle to get financing. That's not to say it wasn't impossible. The Wye Valley line, that fought through this railway depression of the late 1800s and pushed through, but for many it spelled the end of what they hoped to be their El Dorado, their fame and fortune. And so here we have Monmouth Troy several years after its closure. So tracks have been lifted from the photograph on the left. The goods yard, again, been gutted. So Monmouth Troy, though, it did have a little bit of an extra lease of life. In the end, it would later become coal merchants, and there would be contractors would use the yard for storage. However, it wasn't meant to be. In the end, it faced certain demolition. So unfortunately, it faced demolition during 1990. However, thankfully, the Heritage Railway community stepped in, and the Gloucestershire and Warwickshire Steam Railway purchased Monmouth Troy and have rebuilt it now at Whitcomb Station. So Monmouth Troy lives on and is now used on a regular basis by a heritage railway, which is a testament to the craftsmanship of this time, that you could dismantle the station, move it and rebuild it, very much like Glenavon did with Crane Street. It's wonderful that a station in our local area has survived. So now we have a look at Monmouth Troy signal box. It was a very large signal box. It had 38 levers, but also because of how long it lasted in comparison to the Usk line, only by an extra 4 or 5 years. However, by that point photographs became far more prolific, and so we actually are able to see inside of Monmouth Troy signal box. And so here, just cut out, is one of the signalmen of Monmouth Troy. I've forgotten his name, unfortunately, but next to him we can also see a very unique piece of railway history. We have the electric token system. Now this is the forerunner to what I brought my friend from Glenavon has very kindly loaned me. So this is a railway token, and so to stop 2 trains from ending up on the same section of track, they issue one of these, or in this case they issued a brass staff, which would have slotted into a central column there. Now, how do you stop 2 signal boxes taking out the same one? Well, you can only take it out with the permission of another signal box. So on there is a button, so you lift the key or the staff up, you press the button, and you have to wait for a response from the other signal box who will send a buzz, and that will then unlock it and allow you to issue the staff, and that is the fail-safe. So that prevents multiple steam engines from ending up on the same section of track, and it continues to this day, although now digital. So another unique piece of history, and here we have, slightly cut off, is a Great Western auto coach passing Monmouth-Troy signal box. The signal box itself would last for a few extra years, the Monmouth-Troy closing about 1962, but again it would remain in use as a ground frame to control the goods yard until the railway line eventually closed in 64. So now, moving along, we have Monmouth-Troy stone viaduct. I have to add the addition of stone there because opposite here we have the Monmouth to Ross line with the iron Duke of Beaufort bridge. So Monmouth stone viaduct, 20 arches, it is 183 metres, or for those of you who still like to use old-fashioned measurements, 600 foot in length. It's made of red sandstone, and it's got two 23 metre, 75 foot steel girder sections, which can be seen here, which bridge the river itself. So it was designed by Christopher Fernbank and built by Kenneth of Crumlin, which I thought was quite nice. And it shows that whilst most of the Wye Valley line was built by firms in Liverpool and London, it shows that there were still locals building the railways. So I thought that was quite a nice addition. So moving on now, this is where we just touch on the Wye Valley line, which is the line that I first started with when I started this journey four years ago as a school project. So Wylesham Halt, it was built for Wylesham. Beforehand, they had no station. They would have to travel all the way down to Redbrook, or they would have to travel to Monmouth Mayhill, which was situated approximately where the rowing club is in Monmouth now, or where the boys' school tennis courts are. So Wylesham Halt, it opened in 1931. It was one of the, I think it was the fourth halt to open on the Wye Valley line. There were a total of 6. So it opened relatively late for the halts, but still saw quite a good career and lasted until 1959. And I know that it was quite regularly used. Many people used to catch the train from Wylesham down to Newport for their shopping or to meet grandparents. And here we have the all-important beer train travelling down, which unfortunately I don't think I will have time to cover today, but that would be headed to Penalt, where they would then offload the beer to the ship inn, which is still there. So now we reach Wylesham Junction. And unfortunately, this is where it all starts to go very wrong for the railway. So Wylesham Junction, it was tacked on to the end. So the railway had always intended to go to Culford. However, they reached Monmouth and they virtually bankrupted themselves. They had no money left. Like I said, the finances were dwindling. There weren't many investors. So they didn't know whether to push on. And by this point, it had already become quite apparent there wasn't going to be the through traffic from Nantyclough to the Forest of Dean. However, they decided to soldier on. And so we have Wylesham Junction opened 16 years after Monmouth-Troy in 1880. Somewhere between 1880 to 1883. We don't know the exact date that the junction opened. We don't know whether it opened at the same time as the Culford branch line or a few years earlier to service the branch line. So this photograph is taken in 1922. Now you would think 1922, that's still very early for the railways. However, by this point the Wylesham Junction had been closed for 3 years. So Wylesham Junction, it is one of the contenders for the earliest railway closure in Britain. It opened in 1883, but it closed in 1917. So it wasn't open very long. And it was a phenomenally steep gradient. It averaged about 1 in 42, whereas most of the line from Pontypool to Monmouth averaged at the steepest one in 86. So it was twice as steep as the main line, plus it had a 20-mile-an-hour speed restriction on it because of how tight it was. So Wysham Junction here, it had 17 to 20 levers. Again, because of the early closure, we don't know the exact number, because unfortunately documents have been lost to time, and also it didn't have chance to become documented. And so with the closure of the Colford line, this box unfortunately went with it. And so therefore we had to delve deep into the archives to find Newland Station. And so here we actually have the opening of the Colford branch line. So this photograph is taken in 1883, and here you have the dignitaries riding in a couple of ballast wagons of the industrial engine. They really were brave in those days to face those elements. And so this is the grand opening of Newland Station. They hoped that it would be able to salvage the railway. Not Newland Station, but they hoped that it would be able to provide new life. Our Newland Station was situated 2 miles away from Newland, so we see another the recurring theme of stations being several miles away from their intended populace remains true. But here we have the station master, his 2 sons and his lady wife on the opposite platform for a lovely photograph of one of the first trains to travel up the Colford branch line. So Newland Station opened in 1883. It's the only intermediate station between Monmouthshire and Colford Station. So it shows how little there was of the line, and that there wasn't the great populations or industry along there. That being said, there was one industry which they very quickly tapped into: Whitecliffe Quarry. Whitecliffe Quarry was a limestone quarry, and this brick wall that you can see behind this lovely Class 14 here was actually the original lime kilns. So we don't have an exact date for when Whitecliffe Quarry started. However, the railway linked into it in 83, and it vastly increased their output. And this later became the saviour of the railway. Whilst unfortunately the line between Newland Station and Wysham Junction would be closed in 1917, its tracks lifted, and then they would eventually be shipped out to France, where they would then hopefully be laid as munition sidings for use in the Great War. However, some accounts say that the rails were sunk en route, others say it did make it, and it was actually laid by the Royal Monmouth Engineers, which would be quite an ironic twist. But anyway, Whitecliffe Quarry. So Whitecliffe Quarry, so the railway linked into it in 83. Before the you had the quarry situated on one track, and you had the main line passing adjacent to it. However, after the railway closed in 1917, the quarry took over both sections of the track and allowed them to vastly increase their production. So you ended up with 2 large hoppers situated over the tracks to load these ballast wagons and later dogfish, as we see here. For some reason, railways like to name their wagons after aquatic life, so you get dogfish, catfish, sharks. It's quite a quirky theme. But after Whitecliffe Quarry, we reach the end of the line, as it were. Colford GWR Station. Reason for the GWR: there were 2 stations in Colford, and they were situated a staggering 15 feet apart. So Colford GWR Station opened with the line in 83. 10 years previous, you had the Colford 7&Y station had opened. However, neither the GWR or the 7&Y wanted to converge at the same point. And so they were situated looking at each other across a goods yard with a dividing line down the middle. Now, this made life very complicated because, Whitecliffe Quarry. Whitecliffe Quarry continued until 1964, producing and had a rail link. However, because of the early stubbornness between these 2 competing companies, it meant that to move the limestone from Whitecliff down to Lydney Town, you had to go through a very long and laborious shunting movement. So, unfortunately, it was Colford GWR station closed to passengers in 1917, but eventually closed for good in 1964, when the quarry then transitioned to shipping its limestone by road down to Park End in the Forest of Dean, where then they loaded it onto the railway wagons and shipped it out. So unfortunately, the Colford branch line never became what it had so pleased. However, the railway became very well known for its tourism. Many people came to see Usk Castle, Raglan Castle, many of the stunning sceneries, but it never achieved the industrial dream that it had. In fact, I have here Murray's Handbook to South Wales, and there's a lovely little bit in here. Usk, a pleasant, sleepy little town, exquisitely placed on the bank of the river of the same name. Now this bit I will leave to you to question. Okay, there we go. Usk was well known locally for anglers, the number of salmon that are caught here in favourable states of the water being very large. Now I'll leave it up to you to decide whether you would still be willing to catch fish in that day. Thank you for listening.
Do we have any questions for Max?
Yeah. If I go through my entire list, we'll be going home in daylight. I applaud the depth of your knowledge, but as someone who does public speaking, I fully understand why you'd be obsessed by this. In the photographs I use as the backdrop for my song Slow Train, there's a picture of Chepstow Station with a blackboard with Chepstow written on it. And notice you've got the same thing here with Little Mill. I wonder if that's just for the photographer, for the sake of identification.
So those little boards were often taken, yes, for identification. However, they were also used during the closure of stations. So obviously in Chepstow it would be more for identification.
Okay.
However, for most of them, so not so much for this line, however, there was a lot of it on the Wye Valley line. You will see lots of these little chalk or blackboards with the station's name written on them. It's just to identify which stations are open, which stations are closed.
Okay.
Really.
Right. You mentioned ladies' waiting room. I was brought up in, as it were, a village in London, Hyde Park, that was the overground, the main branch line station, second station on the line from Chingford to Liverpool Street. And up until I was 10, 11, my mother used to take me up to London once a week, effectively to go to the India shop and actually buy joss sticks to take out the first cigarette smoke. But we had a ladies' waiting room throughout that time with a coal fire, and that station often won awards for its displays of geraniums in hanging baskets, beds and planters. A lovely station, and we got on the right side. When we came back from town, we were the wrong side. There was an underpass and a bridge, but my mum would wait for the train to go and she'd wait for a wave for the station master, and we'd just cross the track. Imagine that these days.
Yes, they did love their health and safety. As I heard somewhere the other day, we didn't have health and safety, we had a depth of common knowledge.
Common sense.
If a train's coming towards you, do you walk out in front of it?
Yeah.
Yes or no?
Yeah.
I wonder what the answer is.
And finally, I have a client in Denny, I'm sure he won't mind mentioning his name, Mike Longworth. His great, or give or take, grandfather designed the Michael Longworth locomotive that lost the competition with Stephenson's rocket. And it's just up the road there, next to where the pub was.
Yes.
His house is next to the pub. So there we are. Thank you. It's very
good.
interesting.
We've got another not so much a question but a comment. You mentioned that the Little Mill to Glasgow railway closed in 1992. One of the reasons for the closure was that British Rail got rid of its, I think, 16-foot wagons. And the radii of the rail track at Glasgow was too small to take the longer wagons. and therefore the railway Gascoigne became defunct.
Yes, yes, I've heard that from my previously mentioned friend Arthur. Yes, yes. Unfortunately, it was one of the things with modernisation. Everybody likes to make everything gets bigger, and for Glasgow, yes, most of the engines in it were 040s or 060s at the largest. So before these massive, great big wagons to
I know Arthur very well.
yes. Another note to say is that many of the wagons that were used by the RAF Glasgow were thankfully preserved, a lot by with thanks to Arthur and other volunteers and Heritage Railway people, and a great deal of them have found their way up to Blenavon, where they've since transitioned then on to other Heritage Railways. So there is part of Usk's railway history still around in these Heritage Railways.
There's just one other comment really. I seem to remember the late Lord Raglan saying that it was his sister, or possibly his mother, who used to flag down a train going through the Kevin Taylor halt, and they would stop for him.
Yeah.
Any more?
Yeah, there's the excellent book by Oakwood Press on that particular stretch of line from Pontypool Road to up to Somerset, I believe it is,
Yes.
which is a good source of local railway information.
Yes, there's also another good book by Middleton Press. It's called Branch Line to Monmouth. That is also a very good source of knowledge. That's where I found most of the passenger and capital figures. So,
Yeah, the other issue is the rumour that the former King George V spent the night in Usk Tunnel in the Royal Train on a tour of South Wales back in 1935, I believe it was.
yes, I agree with this gentleman here. I thought it was Edward VIII.
Well, one of them,
But yes, a Royal
that's on,
Monarch
yeah.
did spend a night in Usk railway tunnel. Yes. I wonder what he thought of it myself. But also another.
Kept the
I
Bats
just-
Company.
Hmm?
Kept the Bats Company.
Yes, well, hopefully there weren't too many bats in those days, but another, I don't know why, but my mind just went to it. One of the other uses for the line after its closure, a short stretch from Usk Tunnel up to Landane was remained used, and it was used by British Rail to store steam engines that they didn't want to use for services, but they didn't want to necessarily scrap them straight away. And so they parked them at this siding for a couple of years, and they forgot about them. And then one day they went up there and they said, right, we'll put a couple of these back into operation. And when they arrived, there was not a single ounce of brass to be located. They had been stripped clean. One locomotive had even managed to have been lifted off of its axles. They had jacked up this several 100-ton steam engine and removed the solid brass axles. So that is another entertaining part of the railway's history. So.
Maxwell, I've got a question for you as
Yes.
as a history student.
Mm-hmm.
Have you contemplated recording the voices of people who may remember travelling on any of these lines? Because a family friend of mine did the same thing with for the Somerset rural history, and it's been treasured. Some of the memories of some of the stuff that was going on in Glastonbury. Is it in your sights to collect some of this stuff before it's?
Well, actually, I was having a conversation with one of my lecturers about that the other day, and that was partly why, because most of this information I've done on Facebook. So the Wye Valley Railway. I started it as an A-level project, and I continued on with it. And whilst it initially started as a bit of fun, I soon realised that it was a good place for lots of people to share their memories of the line. And so many of their memories have been written down in comments. However, yes, it would be lovely to have these voices immortalised, as it were, and their stories for future people to listen.
Yeah. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Another question? I've got another two comments. One, about 3 or 4 years ago, I found on YouTube or somewhere a video of a train journey from Usk down towards Little Mill,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly crossing what used to be the old road bridge south of Usk station.
Mm-hmm.
You could see exactly where you were,
Yes.
and it's probably still on the internet somewhere, but I haven't looked for a very long time. The second point is the road entrance to the goods yard, which is this side of the old railway bridge. The weighing station was back in about 2019 or 2020 removed and taken to a heritage station, but I don't know where it went.
Gloucestershire and Warwickshire, so it's actually next to Monmouthshire. So it's quite a lovely coincidence really that Usk Weybridge and Monmouthshire station will be forever together in Gloucestershire.
Right.
But by the way, if anybody has any photographs of the road bridge by the goods yard, I would be very grateful to see them, because I'm yet to actually find a photograph of how the road and the railway merged at that point. So that's just
Right, well thanks very much, Max. I have certainly learnt a lot tonight. I never knew that half these little stations even